Hi again. Hello, not yet. Hello, everyone. Hi. Can you all hear me? Wonderful. So we are back. Welcome back. And I hope you enjoyed your break and are ready for the next part of today's program. I'd like to take a moment to introduce Professor Lisa Singh, who is a professor and chair of computer science here at Georgetown University, and also the director of the Massive Data Institute at the McCourt School of Public Policy. And she will be sharing some amazing information about the Georgetown University Wikipedia Edit-a-thon for Women's History Month. Welcome, Lisa.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. First, thank you for this event. This is just an amazing event to be at. Did you know that only 15% of contributions to Wikipedia are from women? Who wants to take a guess at the percentage of Wikimedia Commons pages that are about women? Anyone want to take a guess? You are correct. It is 20%, but that is way too low. So last year, the Massive Data Institute partnered with Georgetown University's Women's Center and Georgetown University Library to start thinking about this gender gap in Wikipedia. And we organized and hosted the first annual Wikipedia Edit-a-thon. And we did that during Women's History Month. So we loved it. We thought it was a great event, and we want this to be a tradition here at Georgetown. In total, we had support from 11 different groups on campus, as well as WikiDC. And before I tell you more stats, let me tell you what an edit-a-thon actually is. It's basically a working party. We roll up our sleeves and we add content related to women on Wikipedia. And there are expert editors that help us. We are there to help newbies figure out how to add pages. Last year was the first, and I'm a computer science professor, right? It was the first time I edited a Wikipedia page, so I was one of the newbies. And it really is amazing to learn about women and to actually share what they have done on the platform. And, you know, we just don't have enough women being shown on this platform. So in last year's event, 47 students, staff, and faculty added approximately 3,000 words and 30 new references to articles that were getting started last year. And we'd love to figure out a way to double that this year if we can. So we have our date and time, and we're excited to announce it. It's Friday, March 21st from 2 to 4, and it's going to be in the Georgetown Office of Student Equity and Inclusion in the Healy Family Center. I hope you will join us or inspire others to join us as well. Thanks.
Yeah, and you have the website. You can probably contact them if you want to join as a volunteer in the spring. Thank you, Professor Singh. And now we're moving on to our second panel for the day, titled Intersectional Approaches to Environmental and Social Justice. For this session, we're lucky to have Dr. Denise Brennan as our moderator. Dr. Brennan is a professor of anthropology and the chair of the Department of Anthropology, and also a vital force for the Gender Justice Initiative. They work on labor, migration, gender, across different topics, and they will introduce our next group of panelists. Professor Brennan, you can take it away.
Thank you. Can I stand here? Does this work? It does. Hello, everyone's all caffeinated up? All right. First, I want to thank Melyssa Haffaf, and where's Alice? Where is Alice?
Over there.
For running today. Woo! All right. So we're hoping to have some really great questions from the audience. This is our intersectional approaches to environmental and social justice. And I see, Melinda, you've joined us from Zoomland. Welcome. All right. So the first person, why don't all of our participants, our panelists, sit up? Oh, you're waiting here to see Melinda.
Yes, and everyone
okay.
else's presentation.
Got it. Okay. Do you mind getting up here to talk?
Oh, I think I'm going to be talking from that podium.
Yeah? Okay, cool. Thank you.
But I think she goes first.
Yeah, so it's...
Oh, you want Melinda to go first?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Melinda, you're on. Melinda is a new assistant professor here in Culture and Politics, otherwise known as Culp, in the School of Foreign Service. She's an anthropologist by training, whoop, whoop, and is going to talk about Hurricane Maria. Thank you, Melinda.
Sound is good?
Now it is, yeah.
Okay. Perfect. So thank you for having me and for accommodating me. I was under the weather, and as an environmental researcher who also cares about medical issues, I do not want to expose anyone to my germs. So if we could get started with the slides that I provided, we're actually going to start by listening to some poetry. So we can move to the next slide. Perfect. I think you have to press the start. Thank you.
Ya habían pasado los vientos, pero las aguas nos ahogaban como hundiéndonos para siempre en la miseria de las cosas violentas que nadie nombra. La comida que nos llega, las cenizas asfixiándonos, los abortos pausados por el hombre que elige y abusa.
The hurricane blew our lights out in a single exhale, the island, mere wisps of smoke. Our sole certainty was abandonment.
Mientras tanto, construimos puentes, levantamos casas, reparamos cables, nos alimentamos entre todos, repartimos lo último que nos quedaba, remendándonos la pena con alguna sonrisa o jugando dominos en el balcón destrozado.
Years ago, there was a time you'd get arrested, killed even, for whistling a patriotic tune. Still we whistled. Still we whistle, despite the imperial boot.
4.645 vidas o más después. 73.000 millones de dólares en deuda después. 300 y pico de escuelas cerradas después. Miles de exilios y familias rotas después. Nos hartamos del Estado.
Next slide, please. On September 6, 2017, Category 4 Hurricane Irma burst the island of Vieques, Puerto Rico, destroying the boardwalk and leaving 900,000 Puerto Ricans without electricity. Just 2 weeks later, on September 20th, 2017, Category 5 Hurricane Maria entered the southeastern tip of the Big Island of Puerto Rico and exited throughout the northwest. The hurricane's width was physically larger than the archipelago, with 4 deaths and hundreds of thousands of people without electricity from Hurricane Irma. Huracán María was a catastrophe for Puerto Rico. The hurricane blew out the entire electrical grid, leaving all of Puerto Rico, including hospitals, supermarkets, and banks, without electricity. The 125-mile-per-hour winds cleared off all of the vegetation on the archipelago. Next slide, please. However, Puerto Ricans had been living in a state of disaster since at least 2016, when PROMESA, the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, was signed into law. Puerto Ricans had faced increasing austerity measures that worsened existing poverty on the archipelago. Many would say that the disaster really began in 1492, marking the start of European colonialism on the archipelago of Boriquen, its indigenous name, a position sustained by the fact that Hurricane Maria bore the same name as one of Columbus's maiden voyages to the Caribbean, La Santa Maria. Uncovering disaster in Puerto Rico is like peeling back the layers of an onion, each layer pointing to the one before, exacerbated by its colonial relationship with the United States, Puerto Rican second-class citizenship status, and lack of self-determination. Prior to Maria's landfall, Puerto Ricans had been struggling through an economic crisis, lack of doctors to treat patients, austerity measures that were closing schools and shutting down hospitals, and pre-existing environmental degradation. Hurricane Maria furthered a dismal reality that Puerto Ricans had long been navigating. Studies suggest that anywhere between 3,000 and 12,000 people died as a result of Hurricane Maria impact and ensuing government and federal neglect. Many people were left without electricity a year after Maria, and some even 2 years later. Thousands of people were forcibly evacuated from Puerto Rico, resulting in increased trauma due to displacement and experiences of racism and culture shock. Many waited days and months to receive assistance from FEMA or local governance, left to survive on their own and rely on community networks to engage in disaster recovery efforts. Next slide, please. Poetry spaces were among the first to deploy themselves as sites of disaster recovery, both in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora. Poetic spaces have functioned as an important locus of community organizing and political discourse across both Puerto Rico and the US since at least the 19th century. Well-established movements, including the 1930s independence campaigns in Puerto Rico and the 1970s Nuyorican poetry movement, a poetic and theater movement that spoke to Puerto Rico's colonial status and the lived experiences of New York-based Puerto Ricans, has also influenced the development of island-based poetics. In the wake of Hurricane Maria, both established and emergent poetic spaces quickly responded to island demands. Concerns over the Merchant Marines Act of the 1920s, which limits international aid into Puerto Rico, sparked fundraising efforts across the Puerto Rican diaspora, particularly in New York City. While conducting research in poetic spaces, I investigated how poetic performances influence ideas about the Puerto Rican nation, its political position vis-a-vis the US, and how the future of the Puerto Rican nation can be reimagined through community organizing and non-sovereign politics in moments of disasters. I began this presentation with the poems of two Puerto Rican poets, Ana Portner Brimmer and Ketsia Ramos. I interspliced their poems to create one cohesive narrative that I saw present throughout my research, a story of survivance and art activism in the face of ongoing colonial catastrophe. For Puerto Rican, especially for Puerto Rican women and non-binary people and others, Hurricane Maria, their poetry after Hurricane Maria worked to embody and represent the constant threat of environmental catastrophe, their experience of life as islanders, and the everyday impacts of colonialism. In the intricacies of this relation, while these material effects have agency and act upon them, Puerto Rican poets also reshape their material worlds through writing and performances to imagine possible futures. Similar to other forms of written and artistic commentary, such as comics, poets engage with decolonial aesthetics. For poets, however, these decolonial aesthetics were not always a call for independence. Rather, the poets I worked with desired a decoloniality of thought and everyday life before national independence could be realized. They weren't always hopeful of a Puerto Rico that would become free. Thus, when they first mobilized at the threat of Hurricane Maria, their objective was to save as many lives as possible and to limit the suffering of their people with the full understanding that colonialism created barriers at every single turn. Using community-based efforts, Puerto Rican poets renounced presidential narratives about their unwillingness to participate in their own recovery. They in fact revealed how community-based recovery is precisely what kept and continues to keep them alive. They moved beyond discourses of victimry to reveal how US empire was and is genocidal in its design. Through their poems, Puerto Ricans imagine the purpose reimagine the purpose of the hurricane, reconnected to their homeland, and use creative expression as an action-oriented affirmation of their right to existence. Next slide, please. Survivance took the form of storytelling by those who lived through the aftermath of Hurricane María, through writing, performing, and publishing their poems. Puerto Ricans throughout the diaspora, sorry about that. Puerto Ricans throughout the diaspora moved their poems and bodies across spaces to raise awareness of the challenges posed by the hurricane and austerity measures, and to engage in disaster recovery. Over the duration of my research, I calculated that poets across the diaspora use traveling poetry spaces. I'm so sorry. I don't know why someone's ringing my bell right now. Puerto Ricans throughout the diaspora move their poems and bodies across spaces to raise awareness of the challenges posed by the hurricane and austerity measures, and to engage in disaster recovery. Over the duration of my research, I calculated that poets across the diaspora use traveling poetry spaces to raise over $500,000 in donations to be sent in a combination of goods and cash to grassroots organizations across the archipelago. Also, in the aftermath of María, poets spoke back to and against racialized tropes while engaging in community uplift. Through poetry, hurricane survivors were able to respond to negative media representations, as well as to empower their communities and engage in healing through highly poetic politics. Poetry spaces were locations where diasporic connections were solidified and reaffirmed, and the poems written were forms of bearing witness to the tragedies that ensued while simultaneously calling for action from the diaspora and allies. Next slide, please. Since the passing of Hurricane María, Puerto Rican poets have faced active earthquake seasons, the COVID-19 pandemic, and were devastated by Category 1 Hurricane Fiona on September 18, 2022. For over a week, much of Puerto Rico remained without electricity or running water. On September 26, 2022, poets were back on the streets protesting, demanding a solution to their everyday experiences. For Puerto Ricans, the weather cannot be separated from their lives, for the impacts of that weather are always enmeshed in larger historical processes and material experiences. As island people, our lives are always entangled with our environment, the mountains, the ocean, the wind, and climate. These entanglements allow for generative and creative practices that permit spaces for survivance, even in the midst of overwhelming death and destruction. Next slide, please. To learn more about the role of poetry and poets through the work of Anna Poitner-Brimmer, I invite you to read my article in the eTropics Journal entitled Colonial Abandonment and Hurricane María, Puerto Rican Material Evidence as Survivance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor González. So we're going to take questions at the end. Are you going to be staying with us?
Yes, I'll be here. I'm just going to turn off my camera so that attention can be on the other speakers.
Fantastic. That poetry was really kind of haunting at the beginning. Thank you for that. Okay, so now we have a colleague from across the DMV, which we're very excited about to be opening this colloquium, which used to be Georgetown-centric. Professor Sel Hwahng from Towson is in the Department of Women and Gender Studies, and we'll be talking about the dietary attitudes and behaviors among low-income trans women of color. Thank you.
Okay, and is this queued up, the PowerPoint? Oh, there it is. Okay. Is this the green for the forward button? Okay, great. All right. So hi, everyone. The title of my presentation is Dietary Attitudes and Behaviors Among Trans Women of Color. I am Sel Hwahng, and I am an assistant professor in the Women and Gender Studies Department at Towson University. Please note that I'm going to be going through the first 12 slides very quickly, so if you want to go revisit them, during Q&A, feel free to ask me. Okay, I want to start with acknowledgements. On the left are the funders for the study, and on the right are people who supported various aspects of the study. Please note that all photos are stock photos and not actual photos of any study participants, and that some of the content does examine victimization, mental health, substance use, eating disorders, and other sensitive topics. Feel free to leave the room if you need to. So with regard to the introduction, women of color have been shown to be often at higher risk for negative cardiometabolic outcomes compared to both white women and men of color within their respective races and ethnicities. When I say cardiometabolic outcomes, what I'm referring to is cardiovascular disease, diabetes, kidney disease, and similar illnesses. In addition, trans women of color have been shown to be at higher cardiometabolic risk compared to heterosexuals in their same race and ethnicity. Racism and victimization have also been shown to be associated with poor cardiometabolic outcomes. And there also have been studies that have shown that nutrition can, healthy eating can mitigate or even eliminate some of these negative cardiometabolic outcomes. So the study I'm presenting today is the first known study examining food, nutrition, and eating patterns among low-income trans women of color. These are the aims of the study. I'm not going to go through them right now. In terms of methods, there were 12 semi-structured qualitative interviews. The IRB was approved by the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health, and recruitment took place in Baltimore, DC, and New York City. These are the different sites and also people who supported recruitment in these 3 cities. These were the interview instrument topics. And this is the total sample. So there was both cisgender women and trans women and 4 different race and ethnic categories. These are the themes that have emerged so far. I'm going to be going through them one by one. So with regard to immigration as stressor, all trans women were either immigrants or children of immigrants. This resulted in absent, preoccupied, and or distressed parents. The trans women sometimes were vulnerable to childhood victimization, either by caregivers who were there in place of absent parents or by distressed parents themselves. And also for those trans women who themselves were immigrants, that negatively impacted their economic status, and some of the trans women were undocumented at the time of interview. This is a quote from an Afro-Caribbean trans woman. She lives in a shelter, and because of that, she has no kitchen to cook. So it's very challenging for her to eat healthily. In addition, the shelter does provide food sometimes, but often it's food she does not recognize, and it's often highly processed food. In addition, she is undocumented, so she can't really, work a regular job. So she goes to workshops or research studies and gets nominal sums of money, like a $25 gift card, and she stretches it out as much as she can in order to survive. Another theme that emerged was that the trans women were either the main or one of the main food shoppers or the main or one of the main food preparers. So in this quote, a Latina trans woman talks about, this Latina trans woman does live in an apartment with a kitchen. So she talks about the different types of healthy foods she's able to prepare. And she is the only food shopper and the only food preparer for both her and her husband. The third theme that emerged were challenges. Multiple participants experienced familial rejection, and one of their biggest regrets was this inability to share cooking and meals with their biological family members. They also experienced other forms of ostracization and victimization. Some of them experienced past and or current food insecurity. Multiple participants were living with HIV, and many had participated in survival sex work. This is a quote from another Latina trans woman who talks about in Queens and New York City, there are a lot of young, newly immigrant trans women sex workers. They're involved in street-based sex work. They're recruiting off the street. And so they're up all night and they finish work at around 4 a.m. At 4 a.m., there are no healthy food options. So they just have to go into the deli and just get some junk food just to eat. And, just because of their lifestyle, having to be up all night, probably every meal they're eating every day is not healthy. Another theme that emerged was this association between victimization and unhealthy eating patterns. This was mediated by either negative mental health or substance use, and there seemed to be a qualitative interaction between the negative mental health and substance use. So we asked about 3 different types of victimization: physical, verbal, and sexual. And trans women had experienced this victimization either in their past, currently, and or secondarily if they witnessed the victimization of other people. With regard to negative mental health, we found that some trans women were experiencing depression and or anxiety, and that was related to unhealthy eating patterns. We also found that some trans women were taking cannabis, methamphetamine, and or alcohol, which was also related to unhealthy eating patterns. So in this quote, this is by a South Asian trans woman. And as she was developing gender dysphoria, she also developed anorexia. Now, being anorexic was kind of a double bind because her being very skinny, she said, actually allowed her to pass more as a cisgendered woman, which was protective of her being harassed. However, she also acknowledges that this anorexia was very much interconnected with her depression, her anxiety, her self-loathing, and she realized that anorexia is very harmful to oneself. Another quote by a Filipina trans woman talks about when she's really depressed, she can't leave her apartment, and all she can do is order like unhealthy food, processed food from Uber Eats or Instacart, and just eat that. And when she's taking methamphetamines, she doesn't want to eat, but she ends up drinking a lot of processed drinks like Gatorade or sugary sodas. And then when she's taking cannabis, she gets the munchies and she eats processed foods like Korean fried chicken and rice noodles. The final theme that emerged was resiliencies. With this example, this is another Latina trans woman who talks about she lives in New York City and she's living with HIV. So she was able to join a nutrition program for people living with HIV in which she received health education. To be in that program, she had to do blood work every 3 months, and she had to show improvement in her lab work in order to keep receiving the food vouchers. But because of all this support, she was able to avoid eating canned or processed frozen food. She had her own kitchen, so she was able to eat food that she mostly cooks from scratch. And she also had she lived in Harlem, she had a lot of food pantries nearby. So she actually mapped out this whole schedule of the different food pantries and when to go to which food pantry in order to access fresh meat, dairy, and even organic fruits and vegetables. So she was eating pretty well. Another 2 examples are from the 2 immigrant Afro-Caribbean trans women. They both lived in shelters. They talked about how they would maximize scarce economic resources by sharing with friends. And the second Afro-Caribbean trans woman talked about how she created this collective meal shopping and preparation as a support system. So this is a quote. She's in a support system with 5 other Afro-Caribbean trans women. And even though she doesn't have a kitchen, one of them does have a kitchen. So they all get together, they all shop together, they all then cook a lot of food together in her friend's apartment. And then they have takeaway containers. So then everyone can take away food for the next 2 or 3 days. So the implications are that low-income trans women of color's experiences are often characterized by extreme vulnerabilities and resiliencies. And more research is needed on the association between victimization and unhealthy eating patterns, as well as on the association between resiliencies and healthy eating patterns. This is our dissemination plan around writing articles and presentations to community-based organizations and agencies, and we are also going to be building from the findings from the study a future quantitative study with a sample size of 120. Here's my contact information. We are looking for more research team members, so if you're interested, feel free to contact me. You can find me on the Towson University website. And thank you so much for your time and attention. If you have any questions, you can ask me during the Q&A. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor. Wow, that was quite an offer for budding researchers in the audience. That's an offer. That's a real offer. You don't hear that often. Thank you. Next, we have a professor from the French and Francophone Studies Department here at Georgetown, Professor Jennifer Boum. Thank you.
Thank you for putting up the PowerPoint. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay, wonderful. So my reflection originates from the juxtaposition of two images. And I argue that those two images, in a way, powerfully embody what Eva Pesha describes as toxic coloniality, the deep interconnection between environmental and human as well as non-human health. The first image is of Marianne Chlordécone, a Black woman posing post-mastectomy, featured on the flyer for Ce sang impur des impure blood, a play written by Zaka Toto, editor-in-chief of the online magazine Zist. She's seen with her wounded breast exposed, connected to a transfusion bag, labeled with a death mark, hanging from a banana tree. The second image is that of Ranitea Maimiti, posing in Pora Tumi atomic bomb in Tahitian, a photograph taken by O'Neill Hwahng. A radioactive cloud in movement eats away at the woman's chest. Her hands are chained at the wrists, and the lower half of her ravaged, evanescent body is draped with a Tahitian flag from which blood is dripping. The image of a woman's breast is an iconographic element common to both pieces. The other commonality is the blue, white, and red of the French flag, worn like a robe in the case of Marianne Chlordécone, and loosely covering Maimiti's breast, raising the question of the gaps and discontinuities in the application of the French Republic presumed principle of liberty, equality, and fraternity. This charged iconography thereby links the biological, breasts, and women's health, the ecological, and neocolonial state practices of abuse of vulnerable bodies and the land. I find this three-way intersection evidence in the French territories of both the Pacific and the Caribbean, especially French Polynesia and Guadeloupe and Martinique, respectively. First, in the context of French Polynesia, the violence of nuclearization and radiation was historically made manifest with the 1963 establishment of the French Pacific Nuclear Test Center on the atoll of Mororua, quote, chosen by the French government for its remoteness and isolation. Between 1966 and 1996, France detonated a total of 193 nuclear and thermonuclear devices on Mororua and Fangatufa, in the middle of the Tuamotu archipelago in the Pacific. Between 1966 and 1974, the French Pacific Nuclear Test Center initially conducted the most contaminating atmospheric nuclear testing. Following this period, and until 1996, nuclear tests were performed underground, mostly in the area of Mororua. Although France put an end to nuclear testing in the Pacific close to 3 decades ago today, the effects of nuclear contamination are still unfolding, having a long-term deleterious impact on the ocean, human and non-human life. In particular, the biological impact of radioactive fallout on French Polynesians reveals a wide array of radiogenic illnesses, including 23 different types of cancer identified as radiation-induced by the French Compensation Committee for Victims of Nuclear Tests. The implementation of nuclearization in French Polynesia thus perpetuates systemic neo-colonial violence against the inhabitants and ecosystems of those island regions. Secondly, in the context of the French Caribbean, the island territories became, in a similar way, the site of environmental destruction, leading to the endangerment of human and non-human life. Between 1972 and 1993 in Guadeloupe and Martinique, chlordécone, also known as capon in the United States, a toxic, non-biodegradable pesticide, was used intensively in banana fields to eradicate weevils. The substance was banned by the FDA in 1975 and ruled carcinogenic by the International Agency for Research on Cancer in 1979. And yet, despite the known toxicity and harmful effects of the pesticide, the French government only banned its use in 1990, and the remaining stock of the product was used until 1993. Today, chlordécone has contaminated soil and waterways as well as all forms of life. Traces of it last between 70 to 700 years, depending on the type of terrain. Chlordécone contamination in the French Antilles clearly reveals a situation where profit for the dominant minority of the Béké, descendants of white colonizers, took precedent over principles of both precaution and prevention. Such practices, according to Louis Boutrin and Raphaël Confiant, are common currency in dominated territories. Just as the effects of radioactive fallout and contamination in French Polynesia were downplayed, chlordécone contamination in the Caribbean exemplifies what I call a regime of uncaring. This regime of uncaring thus becomes one way to interpret toxic coloniality. Practices that display a blatant disregard for both human and non-human lives and ecosystems. Rather than sustaining life, these practices cause lasting harm and irreversible transformation. Contextualized within the history of environmental violence and bodily experience of abuse in French Caribbean and French Polynesian contexts, these images that I just showed you anchor my discussion in a gendered way, centering the motif of the cancerous breast to embody neglect and abuse, as well as to simultaneously incarnate forms of vulnerability that signal the urgency of care. In the interest of time, I will only focus on one particular set of images. We can go back to those during the Q&A. So the first image is a photograph, a portrait of Audrey by photographer Adeline Rapon that was displayed in the context of the Paris Amazon exhibit, one iteration of an ongoing photography exhibit centering women and their relationship to their healing body, following breast cancer spanning across the different departments and territories of France, Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Polynesia, Réunion, and Guyana, French Guyana, and conducted by the association Projet Amazon since 2017, and paintings by Gauguin in the Orientalist and primitivist tradition, namely Femmes Caraïbes, so Caribbean women or naked women with sunflowers, that dates back to 1889, and Te Arrivaine, or women with mangoes, dating back to 1898. Considering Audrey's portrait, we see the Black woman seated on a Rococo-style sofa. She's bare-chested, and her hands are crossed, resting on her lower body, which is swathed in a voluminous pink shirt. The background is decorated with a tropical print wallpaper densely packed with vegetation. Audrey's left shoulder is turned so that her scarred left breast points confidently toward the viewer. She's positioned in the center of the frame, sitting tall. Her head, wrapped in a turban, is tilted backwards, and her gaze is aimed defiantly down toward the viewer, or us. While the tropical background appears to be an allusion to exotic fantasies of lush, mysterious vegetation, everything about this photograph functions as a constitutive contrast to the invented portrayal of submissive and enticing women in an Eden-like landscape à la Gauguin ou Bougainville. For indeed, as Laurence Cachot reminds us in Women and Her Image in the works of Victor Segalen, the Western construction of exotic femininity resides in the vision of, quote, a beloved woman as, and I continue quoting, a fantasy woman idealized who is part of a supernatural vision. In this way, la femme, the woman, as a depersonalized, essentialized object of desire, remains undetermined, irrevocably absent from her own body. Although Audrey's mouth remains closed, her body speaks volumes. asserting her embodied self outside of a fantasy world which would deny women rights to their own bodies under the diktat of the male gaze. Going back to Gauguin's paintings, the female body is not so much physically absent as it is genericized. Gauguin's Femme Caraïbe features a fully nude, brown-skinned woman in a standing pose, exposing her front to the viewer. As for the woman posing in Théâtre Vainé, she reclines on a grassy hill. She holds a large red fan behind her head, and the only piece of clothing is the white cloth covering her groin. The noun, the woman, is in the singular and refers to a prototypical category. Moreover, the semi-naked or fully nude female form is merged into the surrounding harmonious, non-human nature. The giant sunflowers, in Femme Caraïbe, and a fertile tropical landscape in Théâtre Vainé. By extension, forming a totality which renders both invisible because both are desubstantialized. What hidden reality, therefore, stands behind the exoticized landscapes symbolized by the wallpaper in Audrey? The wallpaper, as an object, presents an imagery, participates in the creation of an ambiance, but constitutes essentially the decor and might already signify the masking of something. By revealing her post-mastectomy breast, Audrey breaks through the surface of an otherwise impeccably silent and silenced landscape. Audrey's incarnated self not only grants her agency and authority in a space that she previously could not inhabit, but also hints at the realities of the land and the people behind the wallpaper, away from the controlled, static vision of an externally defined, virginal, and unspoiled tropical land. In this gesture of reclamation, the woman in the photograph actively replaces the exotic-sized imagery of French overseas regions, like the French Caribbean and French Polynesia, with the devastating reality of breast cancer. As we saw in María Chlordicon and Pora Atoumi, the risk of developing cancer, especially at a younger age, is intimately linked to exposure to environmental contaminants, which itself signals blatant uncaring for human and non-human health in these environments. Yet the portraits forming the Amazon's exhibits conversely suggest the opposite. The visibility of women's embodied experiences with breast cancer reconfigures a space in which caring for the self, for others, and for each other might be reclaimed. Caring, or the concept of care in a broad sense, encompasses values such as attentiveness, responsibility, nurturance, and attention. And I quote here, "On the most general level," Berenice Fischer and John Tronto write, "caring can be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world, so that we can live in it as well as possible." End of quote. We find, though, that since the 1980s, when the field of care studies first emerged, theorists of care have continuously grappled with the fact that caring, although essential to sustain and reproduce life, has historically been undervalued, rendered invisible, and largely assigned, quote, on the basis of kinship, wife, daughter, mother, gender as women, and sometimes race and class as members of a subordinate group, end of quote. In other words, these scholars have shown, though more often with an emphasis on North American and Western Europe, that caring and coercion are closely entangled with social systems that enable an individual to demand the services of support of another. Some may assume, then, that caring could be a site of oppression, where women are most often relegated to the role of invisible or invisibilized caregivers, depriving them of the possibility of receiving care. But in the case of the Amazons, because their corporeality, like that of Audrey's, is reclaimed from a place of mutual vulnerability, their breasts, care, and healing are inward-looking, while also articulating transoceanically and decolonially an outward-looking practice of attention that was never there. To challenge uncaring is therefore profoundly embodied, as such praxis of resistance originates from the sight of women's breasts. Women across French Polynesia and the French Caribbean reclaiming their breasts post-cancer diagnosis and or post-mastectomy become central to shaping a space in which care can be reimagined, that is, untied from colonial forms of violence against human and non-human life alike. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mackay. Now we have someone from the Law Center, Professor Allegra McLeod, talking about abolition and environmental justice.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here, for your engagement, these powerful presentations this afternoon. My remarks are entitled Abolition and Environmental Justice and focus on a recently published article and book in progress related to contemporary movements for abolition. Abolition describes the long struggle to abolish slavery, colonialism, and white supremacy, and also to create a new racially egalitarian social democracy. As scholar activist Angela Davis, following W.E.B. Du Bois, explains, the movement for abolition consisted of both a negative, eliminatory project organized around ending slavery and a positive project of social democratic world-making. While the Civil War formally ended slavery, the positive world-making project of abolition, what Du Bois and Davis call abolition democracy, faced violent and concerted opposition and did not in fact take shape during Reconstruction, nor has it materialized ever since. Instead, chattel slavery was replaced by the convict lease and peonage, and black codes forced many emancipated people to continue to labor on plantations. The instruments of criminal law enforcement specifically played an outsized role in these afterlives of slavery, while white supremacist violence directed against limited black economic gains enjoyed impunity. These dynamics continued into the 20th and 21st century with redlining and racial segregation, racially predatory policing and incarceration, the siting of toxic waste, and the consequent imposition of premature death disproportionately in Black and Indigenous communities in ways some of my co-panelists have begun to illuminate this afternoon, alongside the extraction of land and labor, especially women's unrecognized caretaking labor. Contemporary movements for abolition and environmental justice, led by Black feminist and Indigenous organizers, regard their work as connected to this long struggle to create the social democracy that earlier movements for abolition and decolonization fought for but were unable to deliver. My current research explores the political imaginary of these contemporary abolitionist movements, which has developed a powerful critique of the connections between criminal law enforcement and environmental injustice, as well as a related vision of how it might be possible still to realize more equitable futures. During my remaining few minutes, I want to briefly address those connections between criminal law enforcement and environmental injustice, while also focusing on contemporary abolitionist visions. I'll close by gesturing towards how these abolitionist visions promise to disrupt the current authoritarian turn in US legal and political culture, represented by the Supreme Court case Dobbs, the affirmative action opinion recently issued by the court, as well as its environmental decisions over the last several years. My core argument is that contemporary abolitionist imaginaries challenge our current reactionary jurisprudence and politics with an ethically compelling liberatory vision of lawmaking connected to actual material circumstances, one that's more historically honest and consistent with democratic values. But before we get there, I'd like to say a few words about the many ways that criminal law enforcement and environmental injustice are entwined today. Protesters who aim to raise awareness about environmental harms and stop new extractive projects are increasingly met with arrests, criminal prosecution, even lengthy prison sentences. These criminal measures more broadly undermine peaceful democratic participation. For example, in Atlanta, Georgia, police and prosecutors have targeted opponents of a $90 million police training complex called Cop City that's slated to destroy 300 acres of Weelaunee forest stolen from the Muskogee people in 1830 with the Indian Removal Act. The facility will also deploy toxic waste and increase flooding risk in the surrounding Black community that overwhelmingly opposes the project. Georgia's Attorney General has obtained indictments against 61 people protesting Cop City, alleging violations of the state's conspiracy laws intended to target organized crime. Indicted activists, including a protest observer and a person who distributed informational flyers, face steep penalties of up to 20 years in prison. During one raid on the protest area, police shot dead a young climate activist, Manuel Terán, nicknamed Tortuguita or Tort, who autopsy reports suggest was sitting cross-legged with their hands raised at the time they were assassinated. In 2023, police and other public and private security forces, mostly in Latin America, killed 196 environmental defenders, predominantly indigenous people who were exercising their right to protect their lands and the environment. Just this last summer in the United Kingdom, a British judge sentenced climate activists to a collective 21 years in prison for organizing a peaceful protest that led to the 2022 shutdown of a major UK motorway. While these actions against environmental protesters are among the most blatant manifestations of what I call carceral authoritarianism, even in more routine circumstances, jails and prisons raise urgent environmental, humanitarian, and democratic concerns. As contemporary abolitionists identify, prisons themselves are sources of toxicity for those rendered ill inside and those subject to polluted runoff. Working in prisons is also socially toxic, and rates of violence in the home are comparatively higher among prison workers. Migrants now are increasingly targeted for jailing, as lockdown confinement is used to manage climate-related migration, a phenomenon legal scholar Nadia Ahmed describes in terms of the imposition of climate cages. So from the criminalization of peaceful environmental protest to the manufacture and spraying of toxic tear gas on environmental and racial justice demonstrators to the toxicity associated with imprisonment itself, carceral policies represent an urgent environmental justice and democratic concern. Carceral authoritarianism impedes efforts to raise consciousness and change environmentally destructive policies. It spreads environmental and social toxins and undermines democracy and democratic discourse, in part by colonizing our political imaginary. Contemporary abolitionists have begun to successfully challenge some of these practices and have offered an array of positive visions of abolition democracy that would eliminate carceral authoritarianism. In Appalachia, in Letcher County, Kentucky, over the last several years, abolitionist organizers have successfully stopped the planned construction of a new federal prison that would have opened on a raised mountaintop that used to be a coal mine. Abolitionist organizers joined forces with former mine workers, with environmental activists, the NAACP, and others concerned for the well-being of imprisoned people likely to be transferred to that site. And through litigation brought by prisoners and an environmental law firm, in concert with a local campaign to decry the allocation of $444 million in federal funds to new prison construction in this region, the coalition, which calls itself the Letcher Governance Project, used the hashtag R444million to draw attention to other sustainable and more just ways communities in Kentucky could use those resources. So even in this deeply red state, organizers succeeded in bringing together a broad coalition, both to stop this new prison facility, at least for now, and to challenge the predatory, economic, racially divisive, and toxic regional development model that it represents, offering instead a sustainable vision of participatory democracy. In recent years, Indigenous and Black feminist collectives have built on this abolitionist organizing to write and publish visions of abolitionist environmental justice. For instance, the Red Nation, which is a collective of indigenous feminists, have proposed a Red Deal, building on Green New Deal proposals that would galvanize public resources to support a just transition to a more sustainable future. The Red Nation's Red Deal draws, and I quote from the vision itself, from Black abolitionist traditions and calls for divestment away from caging, criminalizing, and harming human beings, and from the exploitative and extractive violence of fossil fuels, end quote. The Red Deal envisions divestment from military spending and investment in dignified work organized around caretaking to restore the planet, clean water, free universal education, healthcare, as well as a broader project of decolonization, anti-capitalism, and the return of stolen lands or land back. The Black Hive is another contemporary formation connected to the movement for Black Lives abolitionist organizing and devoted specifically to climate and environmental justice efforts. It represents more than 200 organizations of Black climate and environmental experts and individuals, including organizers, cultural workers, advocates, activists, data scientists, engineers, technologists, and strategists. And the Black Hive's climate mandate offers a related vision of environmental justice that's focused on, among other goals, quote, divestment from carceral and police responses to climate disasters, all while articulating a capacious vision of justice and law, of the rights of nature and human claims to live on a planet that is survivable, sustainable for all. In contrast to the US Supreme Court's recent case law, which defines democracy in reference to originalism and textualism in highly formalist and ahistorical terms, the Red Deal and the Black Climate Mandate attend to our actual history, to the material conditions necessary for democracy and for human flourishing, a vision of law created by we the people, where government and law serve to protect human beings and the planet. There's much more to say about these projects, but I'll stop there and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor McLeod. And our last presentation this afternoon is from Professor Yuki Kato from the Sociology Department here, Challenging the Binaries Through Prefigurative Urbanism, Reflections from Gardens of Hope. Thank you.
Thank you all for staying until the end. Do I need this? Do I speak into this, or do I just, okay, don't worry about that. Okay, there you go. All right, so this is more of a very quick overview of this book that I have recently finished that should be coming out sometime in the spring. And the research is about the post-Katrina New Orleans, which, if you can imagine, it's 19 years ago. I was a faculty at Tulane from 2008 through 2015. And during that time, I began a research project looking at the group of urban growers, farmers, gardeners, who were starting very unique kind of what I would call urban cultivation, essentially farms and gardens across the city. And I just kind of followed them for the next 15 years because I took my time. So it was supposed to be a one-time interview, and then it became multiple interviews. And then 15 years later, I just finally finished the book. But what I wanted to share today is really some of the core concept in that book, and specifically about the kind of ways in which people who are on the ground doing something in the city are making very interesting political contribution without necessarily calling themselves activists. And so, as is always the case, question like this comes out of my field work. And so I had a series of interviews about how they got, had access to the land, why they're growing, what they're growing, how they're, where they're selling or donating. It's sort of a very, what you might expect to be the kind of question you want to ask urban farmers. And but before we even got started, we kind of stumbled over what to call it. Some of the projects were called farms. all of those are very much just an urban lot. I mean, New Orleans lots are slightly larger than what we might find in DC, but still, it's just an urban lot. And so, you know, footprint of a home. And some of them were called farms, others were called gardens, and then others had a very unique, you know, kind of a creative names. And I said, is this a garden or a farm? Do you call yourself a farmer, a gardener? What is this? And that basically was the first 20 minutes of the conversation, and was literally question number 2. And so I realized that this is important. The reason why it took so long to answer these questions is because that's really something that they were trying to also figure out themselves. And so some of the garden growers, and the term that I came to realize they use is a grower instead of a gardener or farmer. Some of them would say, well, I call this a farm, but really, honestly, it's a garden. Or others would say, I call this a garden, but really, I would think that's a farm. And so I said, okay, well, walk me through that thinking process. And what it came to is that they were grappling with this binary between farm and garden. And for many of us who may not really necessarily think about the distinction, if we stop to sort of ask ourselves, when I say farm, what comes to your mind? Or when I say farmer, what comes to your mind? And a lot of the growers felt that farming is very much situated in a rural area. It's supposed to be a commercial, large-scale farm with the tractors and the cattle and the, you know, and the garden on the other hand. And so they didn't feel like the farm terminology applied to what they were doing in the city, again, at the, you know, size that they were, scale that they were growing. At the same time, they hesitated to call themselves garden or their project garden or themselves gardener because, historically speaking, gardens are really a hobby and leisure space. And as I really sort of started to talk about this more, I do think also this is a very gender distinction, right? Farming is serious. Farming is economic. Farming is something that that is, you know, scientific, and it's very much a livelihood, right? Garden is a hobby. Gardening is supposed to be pretty. Gardening is supposed to be something that you do for fun, for your personal fulfillment, not necessarily for commercial production. And the reason why they really could not necessarily find themselves in either of this very much kind of the non-median Venn diagram is because what they were doing oftentimes were a little bit of both. And as I really start to think about the kind of work that they were doing in New Orleans, I start to really see in other places where these group of growers were doing things that did not fit this kind of a typically considered to be a competing or a binary category. So for example, you know, urban growth, the development is oftentimes considered to be in competition with the sustainability and ecological preservation of urban nature and ecological I guess, capacity. But at the same time, they were cultivating things. They were growing. They were adding value to the space, but not in a way that developers and planners may think about the value of the land. They also were challenging this binary between private and personal spaces or practice and the public and the communal, again, ownership of the land or the practice. So many of them, some of them owned a lot, others actually leased a lot, but the space oftentimes were really considered to be fluid spaces. Sometimes community member would come and just hang out. Children do not know boundaries, and they would just wander on and start wanting to hang out with the chickens. And the growers were like, I guess that's what we do now. They didn't necessarily set out to be the, you know, daycare for the community, but especially in the neighborhood where there weren't that many, well, actually there was no playground. There were not many aftercare programs. Parents were working. And so they said, I guess just as long as your parents are okay, you can just come and maybe you can work and earn a couple bucks. And so in that sense, they were creating this space that were somewhat communal, but at the same time, this was their work. They were producing things to sell or to donate. This is also considered to be some kind of a private entity. And again, it's different from the community garden or the kind of spaces that are considered to be public, right? In a sense of the city regulates it and has some kind of a attorney that signs off for the liability. But they were really kind of towing this space that, yes, this is my space, but you all can come in and you can tell us how you want to grow. And so they were kind of pushing this binary in that way. In terms of the tension, and some of you may remember, again, it's been a little while, but I think it just keeps resurfacing every time there is a major disaster. The tension between the newcomers, gentrifiers, carpetbaggers, whatever we might call it, that came often with good intention to New Orleans post-Katrina, and began to change the culture and an economic makeup of the city. And also there was a lot of the local grassroots movement that were pushing back against this kind of a neoliberal, capitalistic, sort of a post-disaster remaking of the city. And most of the New Orleans research post-Katrina is about that tension, right? The outsiders coming in and with their funding and their resources, really sort of kind of, in a way, taking it over as if the city never really had their own agenda and ideas and identities. And then the community groups pushing back at this idea that are just being presented to them as this is where cities should be going. In the space that I was studying in urban agriculture and urban farming, again, I'm still kind of toying around different terms, but that kind of distinction was not really that clear either, right? Some of the newcomers really worked hard with the local communities to earn their trust and had the longevity of the work. And sometimes long-term residents were the ones that were actually using the kind of terms that I associated with the newcomers coming in as if there was nothing here before. And sometimes newcomers will be the one that would be talking about food justice and environmental justice, right? So it was not that simple that the long-term residents always knew exactly what to do, and then the newcomers had no idea. There was a lot of the mutual learning that happened in that space. Not to say that it was always kind of even in terms of the power balance, but still, I did not find the kind of tension that I was hearing about and seeing, as somebody who was living in the city, everywhere in the city. Hope and despair is something that's kind of central to my book. It is called Garden of Hope. I do think that there is a lot of somewhat understandable but also unreasonable hope that gets ascribed to gardening. Every time I tell folks that I do research on urban ag, people's eyes light up and go, oh, I really love to see more gardens in the city. It is great. We should all support gardens. And I have never really met anybody who is like, I hate urban ag. We should never have it, right? So it's kind of nice to walk into this place, people like excited to tell me about it. But then I realized that there is so much that we think garden can fix. Right? We can fix childhood obesity. We can create green new jobs. We can actually create cities sustainable. We can actually create new ways of actually land use and everything else. And I go, it's just a garden. It's a lot. And so I do think that there are ways in which we actually tend to sort of ascribe a lot of those hopes. But at the same time, again, in post-Katrina New Orleans, there was a lot of reason to be to despair, because help was coming in, especially for long-term residents who were struggling to come back and struggling to rebuild and struggling to sort of keep being able to sort of sustain their claim in the city. There was not many reasons to be hopeful. And what I found was that the growers were not idealists who were like, I'm going to start a garden and everything's going to be great. They didn't necessarily believe that. But at the same time, they weren't going to just sit down and just let something else happen to them. And the way they retain hope is by doing something very concrete, something that they can get a hands on tomorrow. And maybe in a week, not a month, not in a year, not in 30 years, but tomorrow I can do this thing. And so I do think that they also sort of kind of balance this understanding that, I'll get to this in a minute, but they were not wishing that somebody else will fix it, right? In that sense, they were not hopeful that the government or the corporations or anybody else who's in a position of power will come and save them. But at the same time, they hadn't really given up on it. They were going to do something about it. And it's the last couple of things were the tension between the values and theory and then practice. You know, I'm speaking in a very academic space right now. And I think there's a lot of ways in which we can talk the talk and run out of time to do something. Growers actually had a lot on their minds, but they don't really love meetings. They don't love these spaces. They just would much rather be out there in their boots and just digging their hands and actually making something happen. And I do also think that this is where it's not that they are there to make some claims, but their actions are very much informed by those big academic or philosophical ideas. At the same time, none of that really matters as if they can't put that to actual concrete, right, manifestation of those ideas. And then finally, I think urban ag, I'm increasingly realizing, especially in the academic space, in sociology, there has long been this kind of disconnect between urban and rural. And I'm just starting to actually realize my own training as a sociologist have been so steeped in, you know, urban sociology and really just kind of overlooking the rural experiences as inherently very much connected to. So just quick overview of my ideas that's central to my book is that it's called Prefigurative Urbanism. And what I'm describing what the growers are doing as prefigurative urbanism, it's because it is about doing something that's direct and tangible in a way that's also very public, right? So that people can see that something is happening. It's end-facing, and what I mean by that is that they don't necessarily know what the end goal is. The point is to keep moving so that they can keep manifesting these new ideas to push us, to let us see what else could be possible instead of talking about it. It's very experimental and adaptive. And so they would just kind of be like, oh, I'm just going to open this up and see what happens. I'm going to grow this. Or if there's a market, I'm going to sell something. Children come over, fine. Then they can actually just hang out here. And they are very adaptive. And precisely because they're end-facing, they're not trying to say, this is what I want to, this is where I want to get to, right? What they want to get to is to move forward and move us forward and show us that we can move past where we are right now. And because of that, they're very much driven by pragmatism over idealism. But because of that, their actions are very much kind of focused on hyper-localized and short-term changes, meaning that I'm going to turn this lot into a garden, and I'm going to do something with it in the next 5 months, right? And so this do something now is very much the kind of a mantra here. And kind of bringing us back to hope and optimism and pragmatic hope, I guess what I'm trying to convey in this book is even something like challenging these binary, right, in their day-to-day practices. What's really fascinating is that when I ask them why they do what they do, they're not really giving me the kind of academic political statement that I was hoping that I could just use to say, like, they are politically, you know, intending. They're like, no, I'm a farmer. I'm a farmer. That's what I want to be. I want to grow. I want to feed people. And if you ask me, I have my own reasons, but that's not the reason. And so all these ways in which they're challenging the binary, it's not because they want to challenge the binary. They want to get somewhere. And if that means that they're going to have to break some rules, they're fine with that, right? And I do think that that's something we actually overlook, these kind of everyday practices that are challenging the norm, because we have a tendency to sort of think that activism is a very specific kind of thing, that it has to be collective, or it has to be sort of visible, or it has to be something that's really driven by very specific vision and common agenda. And I guess what I'm saying is that there are other places where maybe those incremental but very concrete changes could be happening across the city. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Well, we have about half an hour for questions before our delightful reception. So Oh, you have the mic, great. You can maybe put your hand up and the mic will be brought around to you. Yeah, that'd be great. Melinda, are you still with us, Professor González?
I am. I'm here.
Oh, fantastic. Yep. Alicia, we have. Oh, thank you, Alice.
Hi, thank you all for your really dynamic and thoughtful presentations. My question is for Sel. I was wondering, so I know sometimes in the process of research, your question gets your research subjects to think about something that they never thought about before. So I'm wondering if during the process of the interviews, you saw some awareness that was sparked with exactly how deprived, undernourished the individuals were, that they had just not had the time to give thought to because they were in survival mode.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna answer that in a little bit different way, and if that didn't address what your question is, feel free to follow up. So I want to talk about why I designed it this way, because when you look at public health research, low-income trans women of color, especially Black and Latina trans women, are highly researched, but it's around HIV. In LGBTQ research in general, most of the research, because most of the funding has been around HIV risk behavior usually, and I can go tell you what my conspiracy theory is around that if you want to know. But the thing is that what happens is that it's very behavioral, and to me it's a very masculinist approach, because a lot of times what happens is, MSM, men who have sex with men, and trans women are lumped together because, there's like the same mechanisms of HIV transmission, right? With the anatomy and everything. And so I was really interested when I designed this study to really come from a feminist perspective. I was trained by a lot of, great intersectional feminists, such as Angela Davis, and like really looking at, how can I, the study encompasses both cisgendered and trans women of color, and then also focusing on something, that is very highly under-researched, which is around, food and nutrition and eating patterns, and so. I used to do HIV and substance use research with low-income trans women of color, in which some of them would talk about how they're in this research fatigue because they're always asked these very invasive questions about like their sexual behavior and things like that. So I think it was refreshing for them to be asked around food, and nutrition, and also there was a linkage between them, and a lot of them talked about the linkage between them and their biological cisgendered female members. A lot of them learned to cook from their mothers, right? Their cisgendered mothers, or their or other cisgendered female family members. So, I think that it. I do think it, a lot of times, I think it was refreshing for a lot of them, because I don't think any of them had actually been ever interviewed around, food and nutrition and eating. But I think it also opened up something for, at least some of them to really look at, this kind of connection and the kind of also being in this gendered female or feminine model around eating, shopping for food, preparing food, and what all that means, right? The meaning we have, it's beyond just the survival aspect of that. I'm assuming here that we all here have been exposed to eating, and we get exposed to that all the time. In public health, we'd call that an exposure. But what does that mean beyond just the survival aspect of eating?
For Professor Cato, even though Asheville, North Carolina, and New Orleans are very different cities, are there any lessons as an observer in Tulane, that Hurricane Helene folks, as they rebuilt their city in Western North Carolina, what would you recommend or advise them after watching Katrina rebuild?
Ooh, there are many, many things. I would say a few key things that that comes to mind is well-intended people who want to go and help, I think sometimes do more harm in ways that maybe they're not really aware. And so I do think that if we want to help, I think figuring out who are actually already organizing on the ground and try to figure out what would be the best way to give support to the existing organizing efforts, if there is any, because one of the things that has happened in New Orleans was so much of the resources that were brought in with the newcomers, and they started their own nonprofit organizations, and had their own agenda, which competed with the grassroots organization that were happening in the city. And so in a way, they ended up sort of overshadowing the folks who were already connected and were aware of the localized knowledge. So I would say for anybody who are wanting to go support, look first to see who's already there. And sometimes really all they need is funding. And other times they need some material supports, but ask what's needed. So that's one thing. And I do also think long-term, paying attention to the long-term impact, because, again, Katrina was 19 years ago. And if you visit some parts of Lower Ninth Ward, for example, it looks not that different from 15 years ago, to be honest with you. What does that really tell us, especially given how much funding got poured into all of those nonprofit organizations that got started in that community? And that could have used for many different ways. And so I think we have very short attention span with so many disasters, especially with the natural disasters. But I do think that if you do decide to go support, think about the long-term support that you can give. I do think that that's really important.
I wasn't sure if someone. Yeah, I'm happy to ask a question, but was someone else going to respond? Okay. Thank you all. Those were such different papers, but also some really interesting common themes that were woven through them. And I loved each and every one of them so much. And I was sort of struck, one of those common themes seemed to me to be about creativity and about the power of creative work and spaces, and whether that's in poetic spaces, in growing, in art and artistic re-narration, commentary, in cooking and eating, but also in sort of a really visionary and different way of thinking about protest and activism that you were talking about, Allegra. And I guess I wanted to just ask you all to reflect a little bit on whether that, like, the creative aspect, and I may be wrong in characterizing that as a commonality, but what just to reflect on why that might be. And then there was also this common theme, obviously, of decolonialization as part of that commentary in Puerto Rico, clearly, and in your project, Jennifer, and yours, Allegra, and the linkage of those, like how to retell a history and the need to be creative in one's retelling.
I'm guessing I'm above everyone since people are looking up. So little, yeah, so, it's really interesting because listening to the various projects, I mean, these were all also aspects of the research that I did. So for example, I worked a lot with Black women in Puerto Rico, and a lot of like non-binary and trans folks were actually participating in my research. So these questions about like food growing, sustainability, like food choices, were all kind of part of the work that I did. Here I focused really on the Poetics because it was kind of like my ethnographic entry point into the sort of ongoing aftermaths of Hurricane Maria. Um, one of the things that Puerto Ricans are often confronted with is like this question of the non-sovereign status, right? So every couple years, Puerto Ricans vote on a plebiscite, which is like, are you going to be a country, like independence, status quo, or statehood? But these elections are non-binding, and they're really like sort of a theatrical performance by the US Congress that just takes resources that could be used to like build infrastructure, roads, and give Puerto Ricans more educational access, right? The last election, you saw a lot of headlines saying that like Puerto Ricans voted for statehood, but only 23% of the voting population actually participated in that election because 77% of the voting population was boycotting it. And the reason that people were boycotting the election is because there was millions of dollars being poured into an election while people were literally starving to death. So this question of the creative, right, whether it be through sustainability projects, whether it be through rethinking architecture, whether it be through reimagining the nation state or what that might look like, is really what I find is what I'm calling survivance, right? It's like people, a lot of the times when I interviewed people, they would be like, independence for what? So that new corrupt leaders can run our country. We are struggling to just eat, right? We are struggling to just survive, right? So what I saw a lot was that these forms of creative production, right, were in tandem with like sustainability efforts, right? People were now thinking about creating an electrical grid that was like off the grid, right? Thinking about farming and having food sovereignty and electrical sovereignty and medical sovereignty and all these other forms of sovereignty that really was outside of this like Western model of like a nation state as sort of a precursor then to be able to like reimagine what it might mean to create a free Puerto Rico, right? Beyond this sort of notion of like the modern nation state, right? And poetry was a way too that people remembered the hurricane. If you know about the way that trauma is stored in the mind, right? Most people don't remember a trauma effectively, right? So a lot of my interlocutors actually were writing poems right in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, and then they would use those poems to actually remember their lived experiences of the hurricane. I could say a lot more, but I want to give the floor to my colleagues.
I can maybe follow up. I believe that practices of creative and artistic expression in the context of the overseas departments are, if not counter-reaction, practices of refusal. That means that you have actions that are being led politically to seek reparation, to seek recognition of those deleterious actions that were conducted by the French government, but at the same time, on the ground, that kind of goes back to your idea of very localized actions where women came together. And what I find really interesting with that association is that they actually originated in Martinique, but then started developing across the overseas departments, kind of decentering continental France. So you have associations in France, and they're also very centralized, kind of usually around Paris, where you have spaces that are for self-care, for community building, for moments where women can come together and discuss illness and health and just basically discuss their relationship to breast cancer in their diagnosis. But in the context of this association, it's something that's happening outside of those spaces. It's something that's happening in spaces that are usually marginalized, that are usually on the outside of the French nation states. And what I find interesting with the visuality with the corporeality of those photographs is that, for instance, if you look at the making of the exhibit in Martinique, which was the first one that was made in 2017, Alexandra Arnay, who's the one who conducted this after her cancer diagnosis, was basically saying that women were trying to negotiate their relationship to their naked body, trying to negotiate their relationship to the illness, to post-mastectomy, to what it meant to relate to your own body after what had happened to you. And she was saying that a lot of, like when she presented the project of creating this exhibit, of coming together and of showing and of living, inhabiting your body, a lot of women said no at the first time they were asked, because they did not want to be seen. They did not associate their bodies with femininity or with what it means to be a woman. That was the original reaction. And then what happened is that they were working closely with photographers and kind of explaining how they felt, explaining how they were feeling in their bodies, and trying to negotiate what was impaired or what was missing to them. And then slowly you see those images, and I didn't have a chance to show you that many images. But for instance, Audrey is an example, but you have another one of Natalie, who was basically, I think, really trying to recover from the trauma of motherhood, of not being able to become a mother, and what she associated her womanhood with motherhood, but motherhood in a very biological sense, right? And then that was trying to repair that fracture, like the original bodily fracture, and say, well, what does that mean for you to inhabit your body as a woman? And what does it mean for you to relate to a space of motherhood while not being, for instance, a biological mother to a child? So I think that that's really a space, like the photograph is a space where women could negotiate for themselves, but also among others, collectively, what it meant to have gone through breast cancer and what it meant for them to then basically continue living after that. So refusal in the sense that women are very invisible in those spaces, refusal because a lot of those cancer diagnoses that are linked to environmental pollution don't include women. A lot of times you have a lot of research done on prostate cancer. So it's thyroid cancer in the context of nuclear radiation. But breast cancer, for instance, uterine cancer are forms of cancer that are very absent. And it's also a way to populate those spaces and actually reclaim visibility. So that's why I think the photographic medium is very essential to this particular question. Thank you for your question.
I'm going to put a little twist on this, and as Professor González knows well, anthropologist Yarimar Bonilla, who's Puerto Rican, talks about all that is wrong with having to, what she calls, neoliberal endurance, right? Like instead of fetishizing all the sites of resistance, all the sites of refusal, all the solidarity, all the collective action, all the protests, like it's wrong that Puerto Ricans had to go out and direct traffic, had to get, water for their neighbors. One of my co-authors is in Houston, and on their front porch, after the freeze, the unexpected freeze, they were giving out food and water. What does this, I like this idea of being outside of the nation state, but then what the hell does the nation state do? Right? And I think that this is the real tension, because I wrote down, it is beautiful, the interweaving throughout. We've got the art, the poetry, the protests, the organizing, collaborative mutual food aid, making of food, growing of food. But, how do you think about this tension and, without overly romanticizing and uplifting all of these very underfunded and often, Cop City is like a grotesque example, right, of targeting and violent action against, and all of these long incarceration sentences, right? Excited, passionate. Anyway, how do you deal with this tension?
I could offer a few words maybe in response to both those questions. I think that in law, this reactionary and authoritarian jurisprudence has so constrained the realm of what's speakable, of what's thinkable. I think that we see this also in our kind of contemporary authoritarian politics. And in the events I described in Atlanta and elsewhere, the state is robustly engaged, but the state is often engaged in a public-private partnership. Those hundreds of people that have been killed in Latin America defending forested land and other sacred sites are often killed by private security forces, perhaps working closely with the government. And so in order to challenge that status quo, I think it's so important to be able to think creatively and capaciously and to have a different political and legal vocabulary. And in law, so much of the reaction is a formation that's in a kind of defensive crouch. And so the counter arguments, whether it's in the reproductive rights context or in the environmental context, are drawing within the lines of originalism, of textualism, a particular sort of ahistorical rendering of US political and legal history. And what I view as one of the many important contributions of Black feminist and indigenous abolitionist visions is that they're offering not just a fuller, more accurate, more powerful critique of the problem. And I was really moved by, Melinda, so much of your presentation, but also the idea that this disaster has a beginning that traces back long before the hurricane. The disaster began in 1492, and that's so resonant with the Red Deal and with the Black Climate Mandate and much of the thinking of these movements from Angela Davis's work to the present. And I think that offers both a critique that kind of devastates the logic of the kind of Supreme Court majority in our status quo discourse in law and politics, but also opens up a sense of how it might actually be possible to move forward in a way that is sustainable. That requires a radical transformation, and that itself can be the cause of despair. How could it even be possible to move from where we are to this other space? But the commitment to both being able to imagine differently and being able to articulate steps in this moment to kind of prefigure the world that we want to see, I think requires both a kind of creative, capacious imagining, but also a willingness to just dive in and start doing things. And that's not necessarily fetishizing the work of protest, but instead kind of making room for, in the space that I'm interested, sort of new ways of creating law, thinking about the youth climate activists that are making vitalist claims about the rights of nature and what that might look like and sound like. And though they're not going to persuade the Supreme Court, they've been victorious in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in New Zealand and elsewhere in ways that are utterly surprising. And I think that's only possible when there's the room to speak, to imagine, to think differently.
Yeah, you really need the space populated by those alternative imaginaries. And I mean, I don't know, going back to your question about the nation state, what do you say to women who are currently receiving a cancer diagnosis and have to fly to France to actually receive proper care? Because they are hospital structures that are literally dilapidated in Guadeloupe and Martinique, in French Polynesia. So truly, what we see there is a state that is a fraud, that is not actually fulfilling its caring mission to its citizens. And I remember there's this little text, it's called the Care Manifesto, and it happened during COVID because that is the time when we realized there was a caring crisis and that suddenly care started actually occupying political spaces, spaces of conversation. But truly, I mean, all of those questions were happening prior to COVID-19. And so they have this little chapter on the caring state. And it's a proposal. It's basically to say, well, what would that mean for a state to be willing, to be caring, to develop services, spaces where people can actually go and seek care. And the problem that we have currently in the French Caribbean and French Polynesia, for instance, is that there's no caring structure in place. So women are creating those spaces, and I find the space of the associative structures to be, in a way, a forum of political action, a form of they're socializing, they're creating community spaces that might actually be inspiring for a model of governance, of state practices that are not yet existing. So I think if we actually spend time looking at those kind of counter strategies, counter models, and let them populate our imaginaries, we actually might then find strength and hope, potentially, to give shape to what we could imagine to be the caring state. But I do think that it's important to actually inhabit those practices, to inhabit those imaginary spaces, because through them, maybe we can hope to see the world go in the right direction somehow.
And I think back to, like, you know, sort of as an anthropologist, like, work on governmentality, right, and what the role of the state is, right? And so sort of responses that the role of the state is to kill and let die. And this is, I think, for a lot of my interlocutors, the way they see the state, right, is the state is a body that makes death, right? And so how do we then respond to that state, right? Because we're dealing with people who the state is external, it's a metropole, right? It's a colonial enterprise, right? And the state that exists locally is a sort of mechanism of that colonial enterprise. Prior to COVID-19, in 2019 in Puerto Rico, there was mass protests where the entire archipelago was literally in protest, demanding the resignation of the then governor Ricardo Rosselló. And people started to kind of think through and reimagine what a different kind of governance might be in Puerto Rico. And this actually resulted in what people called asambleas de pueblo, which were like town assemblies, where literal, like, towns, like people in all of the 79 municipalities in Puerto Rico would actually have town meetings in a town square, and the entire community was involved, and they were intended to be non-leadered sort of meetings, right? Where literally anyone in the community could come and speak and talk about what needed to be done in the community. And so there was kind of like this uprising, right? Maybe we could use the word revolution or radical reimagining of what governance could look like outside of state structure, what it would look like if communities really became responsible for themselves and each other, thinking through care work, right? Thinking like, what is actually community care work? And I did attend a bunch of these as part of my field work. And some communities were like, we need to take out the leaves from the gutters because that's causing flooding. And some communities were like, we need to fix this bridge. And so, like, some of the stuff was very real infrastructural issues. But also what you saw happening and is continuing to happen in Puerto Rico is like alternative medical locations, right? You have centers of mutual aid that are now, you know, doing doula and birthing work, centers of mutual aid that are like building houses and infrastructure, centers of mutual aid that are doing all these things. Unfortunately, and obviously due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this huge sort of movement was also impacted by colonial regimes that then would fine Puerto Ricans $500 per person if they broke the curfew. It was a sort of fine that was not on tourists, just actual residents of Puerto Rico. So the pandemic did impact this movement, but there was a hope that I saw all of my interlocutors feeling in this moment of like, wow, look at us. Like, we're actually creating something outside of the colonial regime, right? And we're actually becoming responsible for our own communities. And that's kind of what I think about. What does governance look like if we go back to like community-centered governance and care for one another, right?
Yeah, and I'd like to just respond with like the population I have been focusing on, and I do have two first authored papers and I've written specifically about social creativity, and one of them is about alternative kinship structures among immigrant trans Latinas and queens, and another one it looks at what I saw was thick trust capital, which is like the heart of bonding capital, and thin trust capital, which is like what I saw as the heart of bridging capital. And that was looking at both Black and Latina trans women in New York City. And I think that it doesn't have to be an either or. I think that there is something, I think just to really focus on the resiliency of people and what they've created is really, really important. And I think it can be, it can work maybe in tandem or collaboratively with more kind of, governance type of, or top-down types of strategies or initiatives. So, in terms of what I presented today, I presented this talk, the longer version at some schools of public health, and, we were talking about, this nutrition program in New York City is so interesting, but of course New York City is a very, it's a very wealthy city, right? So we're like looking at, well, how could we take the nutrition program that they have offered for people living with HIV in New York City and adapt it to a much poorer city like Baltimore City, right? And how could that happen? And it might have to be kind of a mix of privatized and public funding for that to happen somewhere like Baltimore City, where, New York City, you have city income tax that, and a lot of like other public funding structures that Baltimore City doesn't have. So I think that, I think we have to kind of really look at this on all fronts and just see where we can, build the movement, so to speak, right? And that could be with the, that's non-governmental, but also government and, I just try to find the inspiration where I can get it, really,
That's a beautiful point to end. Do you want to close us out?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. I shall do that. Thank you all for being here. Hello again. We didn't want to be too late on the schedule and want to make sure that you can all mingle and connect and network after this. Thank you for this beautiful day. Thank you for participating. Thank you to our panelists, moderators, attendees, without whom this event wouldn't be possible. We really enjoyed your thoughtful engagement, participation. We've had rich conversations about all of these different topics, looking at environmental, racial, disability, and all these topics are all interconnected and multi-layered issues. And we hope that this inspired you to learn more, do more research, connect in different ways. And we invite you to join us now at the reception next door at the presidential room. Before that, we would love to take a group picture with everybody outside of the room. If you want to participate into that, feel free to do so. And we hope to see you at more of our events at the Gender Justice Initiative. We have a lot going on all throughout the year. Feel free to join our mailing list on the website, follow us on social media. I just wanted to remind you we're a cross-campus effort so we connect the medical center, the law center, and everything else on the main campus. And we try to support research programs that have to do with intersectional gender justice. So there's other ways to get involved with the initiative, and we encourage you to do so. Thank you, everyone. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to say anything. Reception. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, Melinda, for joining us while being under the weather. And thank you for our panelists for a second panel. And see you all soon and see you next door. First picture and then food and drinks. Thank you.